Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, and with me is Sam. Today we're asking about that classic couple question. When are you getting married? Because once you say it out loud, it can start to sound less like interest and more like you're managing someone else's relationship timeline.
Yeah, and the awkward part is that people treat marriage like it's just waiting to happen on schedule, when a lot of couples are not there yet for very ordinary reasons. Pew found that among cohabitors who want to get married someday, 2/3 say they are not engaged or married because either they or their partner are not financially ready in some way.
Right, so this is not just nosiness with a party hat on. Let's start with the core suspicion here. When does a question about marriage turn into a deadline project? And what should we do with that pressure? Sam, start us off.
I think the annoying part of, so when are you getting married, is that it doesn't really sound like curiosity. It sounds like somebody is turning your relationship into a project with a due date. Maybe that's unfair to the person asking, but the social effect is still there. Your life gets treated like something the whole room is tracking, and now everybody acts like they deserve an update. That's a weird amount of management for one little question.
That's the suspicious version, and I get why it lands that way. But I want to separate two things right away: pressure and intent. A question can be intrusive without being a scheme, and it can feel controlling without the asker sitting there plotting anything. If we don't make that distinction, we end up calling every awkward family question some giant act of domination. And then the argument gets sloppy pretty fast.
Sure, but the pressure is not imaginary. If you ask it at a family dinner, a wedding, a holiday, any of those situations where people are already performing happiness in public, you're not just asking about a date. You're making a private decision answerable to the room. And suddenly everybody gets to react like the couple is on track, behind, or somehow failing adulthood. That changes the shape of the conversation, even if nobody says anything mean.
And that's the part people underestimate. Once the question is out there, it creates a fake timeline, even if nobody says the words out loud. Now the couple has to answer for money, jobs, values, readiness, maybe whether they even want marriage at all. And those are not little details you can compress into one cheerful sentence between appetizers and dessert. The question looks tiny, but it pulls on a whole stack of private stuff.
Right, because the real answer is usually some messy combination of, we're thinking about it, we're not sure, we're saving money, we have family stuff, or we don't want to explain this to you. But the question acts like there's a clean yes or no flag on the relationship, like people are either moving correctly or failing some hidden test. It turns a messy, private situation into a little social scorecard, and that's where it starts feeling off.
That is the useful complaint. A lot of people are using the question as shorthand for, how are things going? Are you okay? Is there anything big happening? Do you need support? In a close relationship, that can be genuine. The problem is that shorthand gets worn out by repetition and context, especially when it's public. Then it stops feeling like care and starts feeling like a deadline somebody forgot to announce.
So here's the question I keep coming back to. Can you actually tolerate the real answer? Because a lot of people seem to want soon as the only socially acceptable response. If the couple says, we don't know, or that's private, or we're not planning that, and you get awkward or disappointed, then the question wasn't just innocent curiosity. It was a request for reassurance dressed up like small talk. Joe, am I overstating that?
A little, but not by much. I'd tighten it to this. If you're going to ask, you should be ready for, we don't know, that's private, or we're not planning that. And you shouldn't make the room weird when you get one of those answers. If the question only works when the other couple performs comfort for you, then it's not really curiosity. It's social pressure with a softer voice. And that's why people get suspicious of it fast.
That's probably the line. Close friends or family who actually have context can ask from a place of care, and sometimes it's just a clumsy way of checking in. But once it becomes public, repetitive, or deadline-shaped, it starts sounding less like, "How are you doing?" and more like, "Give us the update." People know the difference even when they pretend they don't, because one version leaves room for an answer and the other one leaves room for a verdict.
Yeah, and the clean standard is simple enough. If you can't handle a no answer without making it about yourself, don't ask the deadline question. That doesn't make every version rude, but it does mean the harmless version has a real limit. The question only stays harmless if you're actually prepared to hear that the couple's timeline is theirs, not the room's.
And that's the part people want to skip. They want the social permission to ask, but they don't want the responsibility to leave it alone if the answer is messy or vague. If you really care, you can ask in a way that makes room for privacy. If you're just trying to satisfy the room, then be honest that you're asking for the room, not for the couple.
Which is probably the cleanest opening position. The question isn't automatically bad, but it becomes a problem the second it starts acting like the relationship owes everybody a timeline. That's the pressure point we'll keep testing.
Okay, but before we argue about what people are allowed to ask, we should pin down why this question makes people stiffen up so fast. It's not just that it's nosy. It lands like somebody is judging whether your life is moving on schedule.
Yeah, because it rarely sounds like pure curiosity. It can sound like a status check. Are you progressing correctly? Are you serious enough? Are you where you're supposed to be by now? That's the part people feel immediately, even if nobody says it that neatly.
Right, and that's why it feels personal in a way a lot of small talk doesn't. You're not just asking about a wedding date, you're asking whether the relationship has crossed some invisible line where the couple gets to count as fully legitimate, or whether they're still
being graded.
Yeah, basically. And once people hear that grading, the question stops sounding neutral. It starts sounding like, are you grown yet, or are you still in the waiting room? Which is annoying, because plenty of couples are serious. They just don't want to turn private timing into a public scoreboard.
And the scoreboard part is doing a lot of the damage. The question implies there's a correct pace, and if you're off that pace, somebody gets to be disappointed in you. That might not be the intention, but it's often the impact.
So am I overstating it if I say the question can feel like a little adult checkpoint? Because that's the insult hiding in it for a lot of people. Have you hit the life milestone yet? Or are we still pretending this is optional?
That's the cleaner version of the complaint. It's not that every person asking is trying to be cruel. It's that the question can smuggle in a pile of assumptions. Money should be settled. Commitment should look a certain way. Maybe fertility is being glanced at too. Or family approval. Or whether the couple is making the right choice for their station in life.
And that's where it gets sticky, because now you're not just talking about romance. You're talking about whether they want kids, whether they can afford a wedding, whether their families think the relationship counts, whether they want a big public event, or basically none of that. That's a lot to drag into one sentence.
Exactly. And even when fertility isn't the main thought, it can be part of the shadow around the question. People hear the timeline pressure and immediately wonder whether they're being pushed toward children, toward a certain age, or toward a version of adulthood that somebody else recognizes as real.
Which is why the casual version can feel fake. Somebody says it with a smile, but they may not actually want the answer. They want to register that the couple has been noticed and measured. If that sounds harsh, it's because the question can be used that way without anybody making a speech about it.
That's where I'd separate close family from random nosiness. A parent asking may be clumsy, but genuinely interested in the future, or in whether the couple is okay. A coworker or distant acquaintance asking can feel like pure curiosity with zero investment in the answer, which is where it starts to sound like social sorting more than care.
So the bad version isn't just a question about marriage. It's a question that quietly asks whether you're following the script fast enough to make other people comfortable. And if you're not, people often want an explanation, even if they'd never phrase it that bluntly.
Yeah, and that's the part worth keeping straight. The phrase itself isn't automatically hostile, but it can function like a deadline, a legitimacy test, and a family values check all at once. So the next question is which version we're talking about. A real check-in, or somebody trying to measure the couple against their own idea of the right timeline? Okay, let's pin this down before we wander off into vibes. The literal question is simple. When are you getting married? The real argument is about when that question stops being curiosity and starts acting like pressure.
That's the useful split because people love pretending it's all one thing. One version is, are you two thinking about that? The other version is, so what's the delay and why haven't you fixed your life yet?
And those are not the same question, even if the sentence looks close. The words can be harmless, but the social job changes depending on tone, timing, and whether the asker is actually listening for an answer or just waiting for the couple to conform.
So what makes it cross the line then? Because I think people hear pressure and imagine some dramatic villain twirling a mustache, when a lot of the time, it's just a bunch of small social pushes that add up.
That's the right question. It becomes pressure when the question isn't really open-ended anymore. If the asker keeps circling back or treats any answer other than soon like a problem, then the question is doing more than asking. It's setting a deadline the couple didn't choose.
Exactly. It can start to feel like you're being checked for compliance. Not, do you want this, but are you moving fast enough for us? And that's where a normal personal question turns into a little public audit.
A public audit is a little dramatic, but the feeling is real, especially when the person asking is not just curious about the couple, but invested in a certain sequence. Date, engagement, wedding, kids, done. Then the question stops being about the couple and starts being about whether they're following the expected script.
And that script matters because couples may not even be on the same page about the script. One person may want marriage eventually, one may not. One may want it, but not yet. And one may be trying to sort out money, values, family stuff, or just whether they actually want the whole thing.
Right, and that's why the question can be annoying even when it's asked politely. It assumes there's one clean timeline hiding underneath the relationship, when in reality, the couple might be negotiating readiness, priorities, and even the basic goal of the relationship itself.
That's the part people skip. They hear long-term relationship and assume future wedding. But some couples are still deciding what they want, and some don't want marriage at all. So if you keep asking like the answer is preloaded, you're not just curious, you're trying to steer.
I buy that, with one caveat. Not every person asking is trying to steer. Some people are nosy, sure. Some are old-fashioned. Some are trying to connect and just picked a lazy topic. And some genuinely do not understand that the question can land like a judgment instead of a conversation starter.
Yeah, intent matters, but impact still counts. If the couple keeps hearing, so when is it happening? What they may hear is, explain yourselves until your life fits my comfort level.
That's why the fair definition has to stay a little messy. The question is not automatically rude, and it is not automatically innocent either. It becomes pressure when it turns into a recurring test, a status check, or a way of saying their relationship is incomplete until it matches somebody else's timeline.
So the simple phrase is doing more work than it admits. On the surface, it's asking about a wedding date. Underneath, it can be asking whether the couple will hurry up, justify themselves, or hand over their private timeline for approval.
That's the clean distinction. Genuine curiosity leaves room for the answer the couple actually gives. Timeline pressure treats the answer as a temporary obstacle. And once you see that, you can usually tell why the question suddenly feels heavier than the words on paper.
Okay, with the basic definition out of the way, let's swat the dumb answers first because people love those. The easiest one is, relax, it's just small talk. Sure. And the easiest other one is, it's always rude nosiness. Also convenient. Both answers are too tidy for a question that can land very differently depending on who says it, how often they say it, and whether they actually know the couple well.
That's the useful place to start, because both of those answers flatten context. A question can be ordinary in one room and loaded in another, and people keep pretending those are the same thing. If a friend asks once after you mention your plans, that's not the same as a relative asking every time you show up and acting like your private timeline is public property.
Right, and that's the part people skip because it sounds too simple. If your friend asks once and then moves on, that can just be interest. If the same person keeps circling back to it, or if it's somebody who never asks about anything else in your life, then it stops feeling like interest and starts feeling like a check they want you to cash.
And the relationship matters as much as the wording. A close friend usually has some actual knowledge of your situation, so the question can come from a real place. A cousin, aunt, or older family friend may be working from the old family script, where asking is how they show concern, even if they're not very good at it.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the question changes once it becomes repeated? Because I can buy a one-time check-in. I just don't buy the version where somebody keeps asking after you've clearly given them an answer, or a non-answer, or a polite dodge, and somehow they think the next round will feel better.
That's the right pressure point. The problem starts when the ask is doing work the asker won't admit.
Like making them defend the delay.
Exactly. At that point, the question isn't just curiosity anymore. It's a way of asking for an explanation without saying, I want an explanation. That's why repetition changes the meaning so much. A single ask can be social. The fourth or fifth ask starts to feel like a demand, even if the voice is still polite.
And that's why it's just small talk is too easy. Small talk is supposed to be light, not sticky. If the couple has to keep revisiting the same answer, then the question has become a little task for them, not a casual exchange for everybody else.
But the opposite extreme is too blunt for the same reason. Not every repeated question is some grand act of disrespect. Some people are awkward. Some people are nosy. Some people are just used to talking that way. The fair criticism isn't anyone who asks is bad. It's that the question can slide from friendly to intrusive once the couple has made their boundary clear.
That's fair, and I think the family version is where people feel it most. A friend asking once can feel like concern. A relative asking at every holiday can feel like the whole room is waiting for the same answer, even if nobody says it out loud. Same sentence, very different job.
And that difference is why tone by itself doesn't solve it. A warm voice can still be pushing, and a blunt voice can just be blunt. What matters is whether this is a one-off check-in or a repeated demand for disclosure that keeps making the couple account for their life on somebody else's schedule.
Okay, let's separate the decent version from the annoying one because when are you getting married can be sincere, lazy, or flat out pushy depending on who's asking and how they say it. The sentence itself doesn't tell you everything, but it does tell you people think your relationship is public property enough to comment on.
That's the clean place to start. The charitable version is pretty ordinary. People like the couple, they're interested in the relationship, and they reach for the one milestone everyone knows how to ask about without making it weird for themselves. It's not always insightful, but it's often just familiar social language.
Yeah, and a lot of people are basically using a script because they don't know what else to say. They may be nosy, but nosy is not the same thing as malicious. And I don't think we should act like every awkward question is a secret attack plan.
And sometimes it's just family habit. They ask about work, rent, marriage, babies, whatever, because they think interest equals care, even when it lands like a checklist. That doesn't make it ideal, but it does mean the asker may be operating on autopilot rather than trying to push a couple around.
But the skeptical version is still real. The question can also mean, when are you going to stop being in this holding pattern and make your life easier for us to understand? Not every asker says it that way, obviously, but plenty of people hear the clock in the background whether you meant one or not.
Or, more gently, can you reassure me that your relationship is moving the way I expected? That still counts as pressure, even if nobody is trying to be a jerk about it. A question can be socially normal and still make the couple feel like they owe everybody a progress report.
That's the useful distinction, intent versus impact. You can mean it warmly and still make the couple feel inspected, especially if they're already getting the message that their timeline needs to be public. And once the room treats the question like a harmless joke, it gets harder for the couple to say, actually, that one's not funny to us.
And the impact changes a lot depending on context. If both people want marriage and they've talked about it, the question can feel like background noise, maybe mildly annoying, but not loaded. If one person is unsure or they disagree privately, the same question starts poking at a real decision instead of just a missing wedding date.
Do you think people hear it differently when the couple isn't on the usual marriage and kids track? Because I think unmarried or child-free couples get an extra layer of explain yourselves on top of the actual question. It's not just, are you married yet? It's, why aren't you following the path I understand?
I do. Once a couple already knows they don't fit the default script, the question stops sounding neutral and starts sounding like a request to justify their whole setup, even if the asker never meant it that way. That doesn't mean the asker is evil. It means the conversation is touching a nerve the asker may not even know is there.
And that's why I was just curious doesn't settle it. Curiosity can be real, but it can also be a polite way to ask for a private answer on demand. And those are not the same thing. One is a relationship. The other is a request disguised as small talk.
I buy that, with one caveat. Not every question is a demand. Sometimes it's just clumsy small talk, and people should be allowed to be clumsy without being treated like they're running a cross-examination. The better test is whether they can hear a short answer, notice some discomfort, and move on without making it about them.
Fair, but if your small talk keeps hitting the same sore spot, at some point you should notice the bruise. The fair version is probably ask once if you're genuinely close, take the answer as the answer, and don't turn silence into a moral issue. If the couple changes the subject, that is information.
That feels like the real line. Ask only if you can handle not something we want to talk about. And if that's going to make you weird or disappointed, skip it and keep it light. The question isn't automatically bad. It's bad when the asker needs an answer more than the couple wants to give one.
Yeah, that's the clean version. Curiosity is fine. Entitlement is the problem. And the receipts matter next, because the real question is how often people are actually asking out of care versus just dragging a couple toward their preferred timeline.
Okay, let's put some actual receipts on this instead of pure marriage vibes. The big thing is, money and readiness are not made-up excuses. They're the thing a lot of couples are actually managing.
Thank you. Because people talk like the couple is sitting there failing a pop quiz on commitment, when the answer is, sometimes we are not financially ready and we know it.
Pew found that among cohabitors who want to get married someday, 2/3 say they're not engaged or married because either they or their partner are not financially ready in some way.
That is annoyingly practical, which is probably why people skip it. It's harder to gossip about a budget than about somebody's character.
And it is not just money as an excuse after the fact. In that same survey, 62% of U.S. adults said having a steady job before marriage is very important, and 90% said being completely committed is very important.
So the social script is already admitting that marriage is a checkpoint, not just a feeling. But when somebody asks, when are you getting married? They're usually not asking, have you checked the boring boxes? That's the part that makes it feel invasive. Because the private answer might be, we're waiting on savings, school, jobs.
Or just not being ready yet. Or it's a logistics answer that sounds unromantic, but is actually responsible. If a couple is balancing debt, job instability, moving, family obligations, or just trying to see whether the relationship holds up under real life, marriage timing is not a vibe check.
No, and that's the thing people flatten. They hear not yet and translate it into problem, when it may just mean the couple is trying not to do a giant legal and financial thing before the rest of life stops wobbling.
Exactly. And that wobble is not abstract. Some couples are trying to finish school. Some are trying to get stable work. Some are just trying to stop the money from feeling like a trapped door every month. If you ask about marriage while ignoring those pieces, you're basically asking them to answer in public without the actual context.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the question turns a couple's life into a public project?
A little, but the shape is there. The cleaner version is that it can drag private sequencing into public commentary. And for some people, family pressure is real. Among non-engaged cohabitors who want to marry someday, 26% say they feel pressure from family, and 26% say they feel pressure from society.
And that pressure doesn't have to be loud to work. It can be the aunt who means well, the parent who keeps circling back, or the general social hum that says a couple is only fully legible once there's a date on the calendar.
That's the subtle part. One useful Pew contrast is that pressure from parents is not universal. 73% of never married adults ages 18 to 34 say they do not feel much or any pressure from their parents to get married someday. So it's not one single experience. It changes by age, family, and probably how seriously the question gets asked.
Which is probably why the question lands differently depending on who's asking and who's hearing it. For one couple, it's casual small talk. For another, it's a not so subtle reminder that everyone around them thinks their timeline is up for review.
Right, and once that review feeling is in the room, even a polite question starts acting like a deadline. The awkward truth is that people keep reproducing the norm because asking seems harmless to the asker, and it feels like a verdict to the couple.
Okay, so if the pressure isn't crushing everybody, the next question is why this little marriage check-in keeps showing up anyway? Because it clearly does something for the people asking, even when it's awkward as hell for the couple.
It does cheap work. It lets people act like they're keeping up with the couple's life, and it gives them a socially approved way to poke at commitment without having to say what they actually mean. Most of the time, that's not a grand conspiracy. It's just a lazy script people reach for because it works.
And the script is stronger than people admit. Pew found that most adults think being completely committed is very important before marriage. And a lot of people also say having a steady job matters before you do it. So marriage gets treated like a checkpoint with prerequisites, not just a private choice between two people.
That's the useful distinction. Once a milestone has prerequisites, people start acting like they're allowed to inspect your timeline because they think the timeline itself is part of the deal. It stops being, "Are you in love?" and starts becoming, "Have you finished the acceptable version of adult life yet?"
Which is insane when you remember they're usually not the ones paying for the wedding, living in the relationship, or dealing with the actual trade-offs. They just want the update, like they're owed a progress report on somebody else's life.
A lot of that comes from family anxiety, honestly. If somebody in the family is used to seeing relationships move in a certain order, then marriage becomes less about the couple and more about whether the family story still feels tidy. Social comparison does the rest. One cousin gets married, then everyone else starts measuring against that without admitting it out loud.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say that question sometimes has less to do with the couple and more to do with the asker wanting the room to feel settled? Like, they don't actually need an answer so much as they need the awkwardness to stop.
No, that's fair. Not always malicious, but often emotionally convenient. It lets people convert uncertainty into a clean little milestone. And clean milestones are soothing, even if the couple is the one carrying the cost of that soothing.
And that's where the real pressure comes from. Not just do it now, but make me comfortable by making your life legible. That's the annoying part. The question sounds casual, but underneath it, there's usually some demand for order.
Exactly. And the pressure is social, but not always dramatic. Pew found that among non-engaged cohabitors, only 26% reported family pressure and 26% reported social pressure to marry, while among single adults looking for a relationship, 37% said society pressured them and 31% said family did. So this isn't everybody screaming at once. It's more like a steady background hum that people get used to.
Which might be worse, honestly. A background hum is how you end up calling something normal when it's just persistent. People stop noticing that they're repeating a script because nobody ever says the quiet part out loud.
And younger singles are more likely to feel family pressure, which makes the whole thing even more patterned. The earlier your life is being compared against somebody else's timeline, the more that question starts sounding like judgment dressed up as small talk. That's part of why the norm survives. It gives people a polite way to signal interest, measure conformity, and avoid saying, "I expected you to be farther along."
So the norm survives because it's useful to other people. It gives them a way to show they care. Check the scoreboard and avoid admitting they're reacting to their own discomfort about commitment, status, or whatever life script they grew up with.
Yeah, and weddings make that even easier because they are such obvious public signals. People don't just want to know if you are in love. They want to know whether the story is moving toward the socially recognized endpoint. It's not always about control. Sometimes it's just that a big public ritual trains everyone to treat the next step like a communal checkpoint.
So the ceremony itself becomes part of the pressure, not because every guest is a villain, but because everyone can see the signpost and starts acting like the signpost is the destination. That's a very efficient way to turn a private relationship into a public status report.
Right. And once something becomes a status marker, people start asking about it the way they ask about promotions, house prices, or baby names. Partly interest, partly comparison, partly their own need to feel on schedule. The question can also be a way of offloading discomfort. If they're uneasy about commitment or about their own life path, asking you makes the topic land somewhere else for a second.
That's probably the part people don't want to admit. They think they're making conversation, but sometimes they're just moving their own nerves onto somebody else's timeline.
And that's the cleanest way to say it. The polite reason is curiosity. But the real social function is reassurance, comparison, and sometimes a little pressure release for the asker. Not evil, not a secret plot, just a norm that keeps working because it does several useful things at once. And the couple is usually the one absorbing the awkward part.
Okay, so the polite answer is people are just curious. Fine. But before we keep pretending that settles it, what is that curiosity actually doing in the room? Because it is usually not just information seeking with a little romance attached.
The clean version is that people want to know whether the couple has a plan, whether things are stable, whether the relationship is moving somewhere recognizable. That version is real sometimes, but the question can still carry a lot more than curiosity, even when the asker would swear it doesn't.
That's the part people don't say out loud. They want reassurance that the couple is on the normal track, that nobody is wasting time, that everybody can relax because the timeline still looks respectable. It's less, tell me your news, and more, please confirm that this makes sense to me.
Or at least, please confirm that this isn't weird. That's a softer way to say it, but I think it's closer to how a lot of people feel. And if the only acceptable answer is,
then the question is already doing the cornering for them. That's the problem. Nobody has to sound malicious for the pressure to be real. The sentence itself can still make the couple feel like they've wandered into a room where everybody wants a report.
That's the useful distinction. Intent versus effect. Most people asking are probably not sitting there plotting anything, but they may still be using the question to manage their own discomfort, and the couple ends up paying for that discomfort with an explanation.
Exactly. And the explanation is not always harmless. If someone says, "Oh, we're not ready yet," that can turn into a public moment where everybody starts performing concern, surprise, or disappointment, like they have a right to react. The couple asked for one casual conversation, and somehow they're now defending their life path.
And some of that is well-meaning. A relative might genuinely think they're being warm, or trying to include the other person, or checking that nobody feels left out. But even warm questions can become pressure if they assume the couple owes everybody a timeline update. The question stops being, "How are you doing?" and starts sounding like, "Justify the delay."
So, Joe, am I overstating it when I say the real motive is often conformity? Not always the ugly kind, just the quiet version, where people want the couple to reassure them that the relationship fits the shape everybody expected.
That's pretty close. I'd call it social calibration more than pure control. People want to know where to place you in their mental model. And if your answer is, "We haven't decided," some folks hear uncertainty and get uncomfortable fast. That doesn't make them evil. It does mean they may be asking for emotional management while pretending it's just small talk.
Which is why the real answer sometimes sounds harsher than the polite one. The polite answer is, "Oh, we're just curious." The honest answer is, "We want the couple to reassure us that this situation is normal, legible, and moving on schedule." That's a lot to dump on a casual question.
And that's where the practical line starts to matter. If you're asking because you genuinely care, keep it loose and let them answer however they want. If you're asking because you need their timeline to make you feel better, that's your problem, not theirs.
Okay, but where do you draw the line between curiosity and pressure? Because I think that line gets crossed fast. The second the asker starts circling back, offering opinions, or acting disappointed by the answer, it stops being a question and starts becoming a nudge with better manners.
Yeah, that's the boundary. One ask is a question. Repeating it, pushing for a reason, or making the couple defend their private life turns it into a demand. You can be interested without acting entitled to a timeline. And honestly, the fair version is pretty simple. Ask once, accept the answer, and don't make your discomfort their homework. I think the clean line is this. Ask once if you actually care, then watch what happens next. If they dodge it, change the subject, or give you a soft no, you are done. That is the boundary between curiosity and pressure.
And if you keep circling back after that, you're not being friendly anymore. You're turning their life into a deadline project, like they owe the room an update because everybody else is impatient.
That's the part people skate past. One question can be normal. A pattern is pressure. Repeated asking says, I heard your answer and I don't respect it. Even if the tone stays cheerful and the smile is doing all the ugly work.
Joe, am I being too generous if I say the group setting makes it worse? Because once it happens in front of other people, it stops being a little check-in and starts looking like the room is entitled to a status update.
No, that's fair. In public, the question isn't private anymore, and that matters a lot. It recruits an audience, which means the couple has to manage other people's expectations on top of their own. And nobody asked for that extra job.
And privacy isn't just about romance. Once people start asking when it's happening, they are often really nosing around money, readiness, family pressure, and whether the couple can even afford the life everybody else is imagining for them.
Exactly. If somebody wants to share money, plans, or why they're waiting, they can. But those are the first things people stop owing you once the question gets personal. You do not get a budget meeting just because you brought up marriage.
Right, and the sneaky part is that it gets framed like harmless interest. But underneath, sometimes what people want is permission to inspect the couple's future. Like they should explain themselves before they're even ready to speak.
So what's the fair version then? Where would you draw the line between genuine interest and nosiness?
I think it's whether you can hear the answer without circling back to your own agenda. Ask once, accept the no, don't ask again in the same conversation, and don't make them explain why they haven't done it yet.
And that why haven't you part is where it starts sounding like correction. It turns a personal choice into a thing they are behind on, which is a pretty rude way to frame a relationship.
Also, some couples do not want marriage at all. That matters because the question quietly assumes a destination before anyone agreed on it. Then you're not asking about timing. You're acting like their life choice is missing the obvious ending.
That's the useful distinction. If marriage is the goal, timing can be a fair topic in the right context. If it is not the goal, the same question starts sounding like a correction, as if the couple needs to justify why they are not following the script.
And fertility adjacent stuff is where people get extra slippery. They say, so when's the wedding? But what they're often really sniffing around is, so when are the babies happening? They just want to keep their hands clean by not saying the second part.
Yeah, and that is why the respectful version has to stay small and optional. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. That's it. It gives them the door without kicking it open. And it does not assume their timeline belongs to you.
And if they say, we're good, then you're good. You do not need a second angle, a wink, or a follow-up disguised as concern. That is how a normal question turns into meddling with better manners.
That's the line. One sincere ask is curiosity. Repeated pressure is meddling. If you want to test, ask whether you're learning about their life or trying to move it. If it's the second one, stop there.
Okay, but here's the annoying part. This isn't just some nosy relative problem. We help keep this thing alive because we repeat it, laugh at it, and hand it to other people like it's harmless small talk. That's the part I don't think we love admitting. The pressure doesn't only come from the loud busybodies, it gets power from all the casual little moments.
That's the cleaner version of the critique. A lot of norms don't survive because one person is unusually intense about them. They survive because enough normal people keep passing the script along without thinking too hard. And once something is treated as standard conversational wallpaper, it starts feeling rude to question it.
Right, and the funniest part is how often people say it with a smile, like that makes it lighter. At weddings, family dinners, baby showers, whatever, the question shows up as this cheerful little ritual, and everybody acts like it's just part of the social furniture. But social furniture still takes up space. It still shapes the room.
So the pressure isn't only the blunt version. It's also the polite version, the joke version, the just curious version, and the version that gets repeated so often, people stop hearing the assumption inside it. That matters because a lot of people wouldn't call themselves pushy, but they still help make the question feel mandatory.
Yeah, and I think this is where I have to irritate the audience a little because plenty of us have asked stuff like this just to keep the conversation moving. You're at a family thing, there's a pause, and your brain reaches for the same old milestone question because it's sitting there ready-made. Not because you've done a deep moral analysis, because it's easy.
And that's why this isn't just about bad intent. Most people are not sitting there trying to control a couple's life. They're copying a script that already comes with social approval. But impact still counts, which means I didn't mean it that way is only a partial defense, not a full cleanup.
And the joke version is maybe the sneakiest one because it gets to act harmless while still steering people. You're next. When's your turn? All that stuff sounds cute until you're the one who's single, broke, unsure, or just not interested. Then it stops feeling like banter and starts feeling like a little nudge from the whole room.
That's the part people shrug off too fast. It isn't that every joke is a threat. It's that repeated jokes train the room. After a while, the couple hears the same expectation from everybody, just in softer voices. And everybody gets to pretend they were only being funny.
So what's the fairer version of this then? Because I don't think the answer is that nobody can ever ask about marriage or the future. The answer has to be something more honest than that. Where do you draw the line between normal interest and the weird little social nudge that says, please get moving?
I'd draw it at consent and context. If somebody brings it up themselves, or if there's a real relationship where that conversation is already open, fine. But if the question is just arriving because the room got awkward and you need a familiar milestone to poke at, then you're not really asking about love. You're asking the couple to perform progress on demand.
That last part is the bit people hate because it makes the question sound less like curiosity and more like a tiny productivity check. And maybe that's too harsh for every case, but it's not a crazy reading either. If you're asking because you want to measure whether they're on schedule, then you're already treating their relationship like a public project.
Mostly, yeah. I'd just keep the distinction between a reflex and a verdict. A reflex is, people repeat what they've heard, especially around weddings and family gatherings. A verdict is, this couple owes the room an explanation. Those are not the same thing. And the first one is common enough that most of us should probably be a little embarrassed by how easily we do it.
That's fair. The usable standard might be, if your question only works because it puts a couple on the spot, maybe don't call it harmless just because everyone recognizes the script. People can be participating in the pressure without meaning to be jerks. And that's actually the uncomfortable part. Nobody gets to stay completely innocent just because they were smiling when they did it.
Okay, after all the complaining, the useful question is, what actually makes this less annoying without turning everybody into an etiquette robot? The answer is not banning the topic. It's making the question smaller, easier to decline, and less loaded with assumptions.
So the fix is basically stop asking like the relationship has a deadline attached to it. Because that's what people hear. They don't hear curiosity. They hear, how far along are you with your life plan?
That's the sharp version, yes. A better version is, do you want to talk about that, or would you rather not? It sounds almost too simple, but that's the point. You give the couple control over whether the conversation opens at all.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the real fix is letting people say no without a whole speech? Because half the problem is the follow-up. You say, we're not talking about that, and suddenly everybody wants your money situation, your family situation, and your emotional history.
No, that's the part people need to hear. When a question hits a boundary, less explanation is usually better than a long defense. If you over-justify, you accidentally make it sound like the asker deserves a hearing.
That is such a grim little social habit. The more polite you are, the more some people act like you've opened the floor for cross-examination.
And some of them aren't trying to be cruel. They're just clumsy. They ask the milestone question because they think they're being interested, not invasive. That doesn't make the question good. It just means the fix is partly habit change, not mind reading.
Fine, but if the habit is bad, the script has to be better. What's the clean version that doesn't sound like a fight? Because mind your business works, but it also lights the room on fire.
The clean version is something like, we'll share if and when there's something to share. Or, no updates yet, but thanks for asking. Short, calm, and boring. You're not punishing the person. You're refusing the idea that the timeline is public property.
That last part matters. People act like once you're dating, your future becomes something the whole group gets a vote on. And then they wonder why people get tight-lipped.
Right, and the way you ask changes what answer you're inviting. If you ask like it's a deadline update, people hear pressure. If you ask like consent matters, you're more likely to get an honest response, or a clean no.
So the fix is not magical manners. It's a different default. Assume the couple will tell you if they want to tell you, and don't act insulted when they don't. That's a pretty low bar, but apparently low bars still need defending.
Exactly. And it also helps to separate levels of closeness. A sibling, a best friend, and a coworker do not get the same access to private timing. If you're not close enough to hear the answer honestly, you're probably not close enough to ask casually.
That's a pretty useful rule, because a lot of people want the intimacy of the question without the responsibility of the relationship. They want to sound caring, but they don't actually want to sit with a real answer.
Yes, and the simple social fix is to stop rewarding that move. If somebody asks too soon or too directly, you don't have to make it a scene. You can answer briefly, redirect, or say, we'd rather not talk about that. The less drama you attach to the refusal, the less the question gets trained to keep coming back.
So the goal is basically Fewer timeline questions, more permission, and a real exit ramp when somebody doesn't want to answer. Not perfect etiquette, just less pressure and less weirdness.
That's the useful version. Let couples control what they disclose. Don't treat the question like a right. And keep the whole thing short enough that nobody has to defend their private life to a room full of casual observers.
So the landing is pretty simple. Asking when somebody's getting married is not automatically rude, but turning it into a standing deadline is. The minute it sounds like the room is waiting on a schedule update, you've stopped being curious and started acting like the couple's relationship is public property.
That's the useful distinction. The question can be normal in the right context. Family asking, friends making conversation, somebody checking in because they care. But it changes shape fast when the asker behaves like they're owed a roadmap. And once it becomes that, it stops being curiosity and turns into a public deadline project.
That's the phrase.
Yeah, because now the couple has to react to a timeline they didn't create. Every answer becomes either a confession, a defense, or a promise. And none of those are actually required just because someone at dinner got nosy.
And the annoying part is that a lot of people think they're being sweet. They're not always trying to corner anyone. But intent doesn't cancel pressure. And pressure is what people feel when their private life starts getting processed like a community update.
That's fair. And it's why I wouldn't make the answer about mind reading. You don't need to prove somebody is malicious to say the question is too much. Sometimes it's just a lazy habit. Sometimes it's family culture. Sometimes it's nosiness with better manners.
So what part of that is actually fair then? Because I don't want to overcorrect and pretend nobody can ever ask. If you're close to somebody, there's a version of the question that's basically, hey, how are you both doing? That feels different from, so when's the event and why isn't it on the calendar yet?
That's the better version. And the line is pretty practical. Ask lightly, don't ask repeatedly, and don't demand a full explanation. If the answer is vague, accept vague. If the answer is no comment, accept no comment. You can care about somebody without making them narrate their private life on demand.
Right, and the couple side of it matters too. They do owe each other honesty, obviously, but they do not owe everybody else a public timeline, and they definitely don't owe the room a little speech about whether they're working on it like it's a quarterly target.
That's the useful boundary. Privacy isn't a moral failure, and not being ready isn't a community problem. If they want to share details, great. If they want to keep it vague, that's also fine. The only real requirement is that the asker stop treating the refusal like a personal insult.
And honestly, that's the social standard I'd keep. Ask with humility, take the first answer, and don't make the couple defend their timeline to a room full of casual observers. Curiosity is fine when it leaves people room to say, not really talking about that.
Yeah, that's the clean version. Marriage questions aren't banned. They're just not a license to manage somebody else's future. Ask once, lightly. Let them control what they disclose. And don't act like you were denied a right if they keep it private. So that wraps this one up. Thanks for spending a few minutes with Say the Question. Follow along, and we'll be back tomorrow with another one.